When a small African nation dares to say no to the United States, the world should pay attention. That is exactly what just happened in Burkina Faso, a country that most Americans might struggle to find on a map. Yet today, it stands at the center of a moral storm shaking the foundations of international politics. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, the military government of Burkina Faso has refused to accept deportees from the United States, calling Washington's proposal indecent and contrary to human dignity. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of history, the voice of a nation once silenced, now speaking out against one of the world's most powerful governments. This defiance comes at a time when President Donald Trump, having returned to the White House, is reviving his hardline immigration agenda. Across Africa and Central America, governments are quietly signing deals to take in deported migrants from the U.S. Sometimes people who have no connection at all to those lands. For them, it is politics. For Traoré, it is a matter of principle. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, officials call the American offer a trade of lives for diplomacy. The United States responded swiftly by suspending visa services and rerouting applications to neighboring Togo, a move that Burkina Faso's government described as blackmail. For older Americans who remember the Cold War and the long struggle for civil rights, this moment may feel eerily familiar. A small voice challenging a giant, demanding to be treated with respect. And perhaps it forces us to ask ourselves, has America, in its pursuit of security, forgotten the very values that once defined it, or is President Ibrahim Traoré simply using moral language to play political chess against the West? Whichever way we look at it, one thing is certain: Burkina Faso's refusal is not just about migration, it is about dignity, sovereignty, and the changing face of global power. When President Donald Trump returned to the White House, few doubted that his immigration policies would again take center stage. Within months, his administration revived the controversial third-country deportation deals, forcing migrants to be sent not back to their homelands, but to other nations willing to accept them, often nations they had never set foot in. The idea was simple. At least on paper, keep America's borders secure by paying other countries to absorb those America wanted gone. But as these policies rolled out, moral questions began to surface. Can a country dedicated to liberty outsource its conscience? Across Africa, a number of governments signed on. Eswatini, Ghana, Rwanda, Uganda, and South Sudan quietly agreed to receive hundreds of deportees. Some did it to maintain access to U.S. aid or military partnerships. Others saw it as a chance to strengthen diplomatic ties with Washington. Whatever the motive, few dared to resist, except for one nation at the heart of West Africa, Burkina Faso. When the proposal reached Ouagadougou, the answer was swift and clear. The military government led by President Ibrahim Traoré declared the offer indecent. It stated that accepting unknown migrants from America would violate the fundamental principles of human dignity and national sovereignty. For Traoré, this was not just policy, it was identity. Since taking power in 2022, he has cast himself as a Pan-African reformer determined to end decades of dependency on the West. His message to Washington was unmistakable. Burkina Faso will not be used as a dumping ground for your political failures. The U.S. reaction came fast. Within days, the American embassy in Ouagadougou suspended all regular visa services. Citizens of Burkina Faso would now have to travel to neighboring Togo to apply an inconvenience that many saw as deliberate punishment. Local newspapers called it diplomatic blackmail. In the streets of Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens began to talk about the standoff with a mix of pride and fear. Some worried that the U.S. might impose sanctions as it had done to other nations in the past. Others, especially the youth, saw Traoré's defiance as a turning point, the first time in living memory that a West African leader said no to an American demand without flinching. Meanwhile, in Washington, the move drew sharp reactions. Supporters of the Trump administration called Burkina Faso's stance short-sighted and ungrateful, pointing to millions of dollars in aid that the U.S. had sent over the years. Critics, however, argued that America was repeating the old habits of imperial power, punishing small nations for acting independently. At the heart of it all lies a simple truth. While the world debates geopolitics, it is human beings who pay the price. The deportees caught in the middle, men, women, and children, have become pawns in a game between rich and poor nations. For some of them, the place they are being sent to is as foreign as the moon. In refusing to cooperate, Burkina Faso has drawn a line in the sand. Its message is not just to Washington, but to all of Africa: we are no longer for sale. And as the dust settles, a quiet but powerful question begins to echo across the continent: is this the beginning of a new African awakening, or just another flash of defiance that will soon be forgotten? The moment Burkina Faso said no to the United States, the story exploded across the global media. Headlines from Washington to Paris called it a dangerous provocation. News anchors questioned how a small, landlocked nation could afford to challenge the world's superpower. Yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the mood was very different. There was music, pride, and an unmistakable sense of awakening. Supporters of President Ibrahim Traoré filled Independence Square, waving national flags and posters with his portrait. Young men and women, many of whom had grown up in poverty and political turmoil, chanted slogans against Western arrogance. Some carried signs that read, "We are poor, but we are not slaves." To them, Traoré's rejection of the U.S. deportation deal was more than policy. It was dignity reclaimed. Meanwhile, in Washington, reaction was swift and divided. The Trump administration's spokesperson accused Burkina Faso of irresponsible grandstanding and warned that aid partnerships will be reviewed. Conservative commentators praised the president's firmness, saying that America must not tolerate defiance from nations dependent on U.S. assistance. But others, former diplomats, church leaders, and human rights advocates, voiced deep unease. They warned that the United States was losing moral credibility on the global stage. If we begin treating vulnerable people as disposable cargo, one former ambassador said, then we are no longer leading, we are bullying. Across Africa, the defiance of Burkina Faso sent ripples. In Nigeria, officials quietly refused to take Venezuelan deportees, citing humanitarian and legal concerns. In Ghana, protests broke out after reports that deportees had been detained in military camps without due process. Lawyers there filed lawsuits against their own government, accusing it of violating both domestic and international law. The image of deported Africans, confused, frightened, and left stranded at borders, began circulating on social media, fueling outrage and solidarity. Internationally, voices emerged framing the story as part of a bigger battle, not about migration, but about power and justice. European commentators labeled Traoré a populist with a military uniform, while Pan-African media hailed him as the new Thomas Sankara, referencing the revolutionary leader who once dreamed of a self-reliant Africa. Russian and Chinese outlets amplified that narrative, presenting Burkina Faso as a symbol of resistance to Western dominance. Inside the United States, reactions among older Americans were mixed. Some saw Traoré's stance as naive or even hostile, but others, especially veterans, pastors, and civil rights activists, recognized echoes of a moral struggle they once knew. A few recalled the days when America itself was the underdog fighting empires and preaching freedom. "We used to be the voice of the oppressed one," Vietnam veteran wrote in a public letter. Now we're punishing those who remind us of who we once were. As tensions rose, the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou remained closed for several days for security reasons. Rumors spread that aid projects might be suspended. Yet, Traoré refused to back down. In a televised speech, he declared, "We will not accept the idea that our land can be used as a landfill for those unwanted by the powerful. Africa is not a dumping ground. We are free nations, and we will decide our own destiny." That moment marked the emotional climax of the crisis. It was not just a statement. It was a declaration of identity. Cameras captured the crowd's roar. Women wept, soldiers saluted. The symbolism was impossible to miss, a young African leader standing firm while facing the wrath of the most powerful country on earth. In that defiance, many saw a reflection of something America itself once stood for: courage, independence, and the belief that dignity cannot be traded. And yet, under the political heat and the global attention, one question lingered. Would this act of resistance strengthen Burkina Faso's future or isolate it completely from the world it hopes to stand up to? In the weeks following Burkina Faso's refusal to accept U.S. deportees, daily life in the country began to change in subtle but visible ways. At the U.S. Embassy gates, the lines disappeared. The familiar sight of students and families waiting to apply for visas was gone. For many, ordinary Burkinabe America suddenly felt farther away than ever before. Local businesses that depended on U.S. development programs began to worry. Would funding dry up? Would scholarships be canceled? Yet even as fear spread through certain circles, something deeper, almost spiritual, began to rise among the people: pride. For the first time in decades, they felt their government had taken a stand based on principle rather than fear. In cafes and radio talk shows, the debate was fierce. Some citizens expressed concern that Traoré's boldness could bring sanctions or economic isolation, but others, especially veteran students and rural farmers, spoke with admiration. If standing with dignity means suffering, a little one farmer said, then let us suffer proudly. On the political front, the decision reshaped the country's alliances. With the West turning its back, Burkina Faso drew closer to Russia, which quickly offered technical and humanitarian cooperation. Russian diplomats publicly praised Traoré for defending Africa's sovereignty. Moscow-backed media portrayed Burkina Faso as a heroic state standing against Western exploitation. This shift worried Washington. Analysts at the Pentagon warned that the vacuum created by declining U.S. influence will be filled by rival powers. But for Traoré, it was a calculated risk. "We cannot preach independence while begging for permission," he reportedly told his advisors. The consequences, however, were not only geopolitical. On a human level, the crisis exposed the emotional and moral toll of modern migration politics. In neighboring Ghana, deportees recently returned from the U.S. filed a lawsuit against their government, claiming they had been illegally detained in a military facility. Some said they were dropped off across the Togo border without food or money. The images of exhausted men and women, barefoot and abandoned, spread across African media. The contrast was painful yet powerful. Ghana had cooperated and ended up with scandal. Burkina Faso had resisted and earned respect. Across social networks, Africans began sharing a new phrase: better to walk tall and hungry than to crawl with a full stomach. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré's popularity surged. Even critics, who once doubted the young captain, began to see him as a symbol of national dignity. Murals appeared in Ouagadougou depicting him beside former revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, both raising their fists beneath the slogan, "Africa will stand." Yet challenges persisted. The country's economy remained fragile, and international loans became harder to secure. The tourism industry suffered, and many Burkinabe students studying abroad faced travel difficulties due to the visa suspension. Traoré's government, however, turned these hardships into a rallying cry for self-reliance. "We will grow what we eat. We will build what we use," he said in another speech broadcast nationwide. For many older Africans, and even for some Americans watching from afar, it was a moment of déjà vu. It reminded them of a time when moral courage mattered more than political convenience. The confrontation between the United States and Burkina Faso had transcended borders. It had become a mirror reflecting the state of the modern world. Burkina Faso's defiance, in the end, was not without cost. But for a people long told that their voices did not matter, the price seemed worth paying. As one Burkinabe elder put it during a village interview, "When a man keeps his dignity, he loses nothing, even if he loses everything." From across the Atlantic, the standoff between Washington and Ouagadougou has sparked a quiet but uncomfortable reflection in the United States. For many older Americans, those who grew up during the Cold War and lived through the moral struggles of the Civil Rights era, this crisis feels strangely familiar. A smaller, poorer nation, standing up to a powerful one, not with weapons, but with principle. Conservative voices in the U.S. media called President Ibrahim Traoré reckless and accused him of playing politics with humanitarian issues. Yet others, church leaders, veterans, and longtime peace activists, saw something deeper. They remembered when America itself had once defied empires and demanded to be treated with respect. "We used to be the ones who said no to injustice," wrote one retired pastor from Alabama. "Now we're punishing others for doing the same." In think tanks and policy circles, analysts warned that Washington's approach could backfire. "The U.S. is losing moral ground in Africa," said one researcher from Georgetown University. "Every time a nation like Burkina Faso resists, it exposes the contradiction between America's ideals and its foreign policy." Meanwhile, around the world, reactions were just as divided. In Europe, many newspapers treated the story as another example of Africa drifting toward Moscow. In Russia and China, the tone was triumphal. They celebrated Burkina Faso's decision as proof that the global South was no longer under Western control. But in Africa, especially among young people, Traoré's stand was viewed as an act of courage. Online discussions overflowed with admiration, and hashtags like #AfricaWillRise trended across the continent. For the global audience, this was not merely about deportations, it was about identity. Could a small African state remind the world that dignity still matters more than power? And for Americans especially, the older generation who believe deeply in fairness and justice, the story carried a haunting echo of their own nation's promise. Perhaps that is why the question keeps resurfacing in living rooms and church halls across the U.S. If the values of freedom and respect truly define America, shouldn't we celebrate, not punish those who defend them even when they live in Africa? In the end, this story is not only about politics or migration, it is about the meaning of dignity in a world that too often forgets it. When Burkina Faso stood firm and said no to the United States, it reminded us that courage is not measured by size or wealth, but by the willingness to defend what is right. President Ibrahim Traoré may be young and his leadership far from perfect, but his refusal to compromise on human dignity struck a chord across Africa and beyond. In the quiet villages of Ouagadougou, people speak his name with pride. And somewhere in America, perhaps a few older citizens nod in recognition, remembering a time when their own leaders once spoke with that same moral clarity. Across the continent, this moment has become more than a diplomatic dispute. It has become a symbol of awakening, Other nations, Ghana, Nigeria, even South Sudan, are now re-examining their own migration agreements. The ripples of Traoré's decision continue to spread, shaping a new narrative of African independence that defies both fear and manipulation. But for us, watching from afar, the question remains, is this a beginning, the rebirth of a proud and self-reliant Africa, or just a fleeting act of defiance soon forgotten by the world's headlines? And for America, another question follows: can we still claim to stand for freedom if we punish those who act upon it? In a time when truth is often buried beneath politics, stories like this deserve to be heard. Because beyond the borders, beyond the flags and speeches, this is about humanity itself. The shared belief that every nation, no matter how small, has the right to stand tall. Please share if you believe that human dignity should never be negotiable. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than the headlines. Together, let's make sure the story of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and this defining moment in Africa news does not fade into silence.